Okay, let's unpack this. We're kicking off an absolutely essential deep dive today, one that really lays the groundwork for understanding pretty much everything that follows in international affairs.
Mm.
The material you shared, it takes us on this, well, sweeping journey through the history of how people, states, empires, how they've interacted, fought, cooperated
Right.
from the earliest recorded times right up to the eve of the First World War.
It's a huge span of time.
Huge. Think of this as, getting the ultimate cheat sheet on the foundations of the world we live in today. Our mission
Yeah.
to extract the crucial insights, the aha moments, those surprising echoes of the past that are just absolutely essential context for the present.
It's not just about dates and names.
No, exactly. We're not just reciting history, we're figuring out why it matters right now.
Right.
So this first part of our deep dive, guided by the source material you've provided, it covers everything from ancient Mesopotamia right through the rise of modern Europe. It's the backstory you need before we even think about the 20th century.
It really sets the stage.
So where do we even begin? I mean, the source asks a fundamental question right up front. Why do we need history in international relations?
And it's honestly the perfect place to start because, as the source powerfully argues, history and politics aren't separate subjects you study in different rooms. Not at all.
Right, they're tangled up.
They are fundamentally interwoven, shaping each other in really profound ways. Diplomacy itself, the art and practice of states managing their relationships, it's born precisely from this dynamic interaction between historical forces and political realities.
Okay.
So to really grasp the nuances of why diplomacy looks the way it does today, why states use certain tools, why negotiations unfold in particular ways, you simply must understand this deep historical and political connection.
So it's not just background noise then, it's like the very fabric of international affairs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And beyond that, studying the past provides the crucial context for the present. It's like getting the manual for the complex machine that is the modern world.
Makes things make more sense.
It does. It eases understanding because, as you often hear, history seems to repeat itself. But the real insect, as the source points out, isn't just repetition of events, but the repetition of patterns.
Patterns, right.
Yeah.
And there's a stark, powerful illustration of this pattern repetition right there in the source material.
Yeah.
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan serves as a classic and, frankly, pretty sobering example. Because of its absolutely vital strategic location, it has been, well, a crossroads and a coveted piece of land for powerful external actors across millennia.
Right.
The source highlights that well before World War II, the British Empire was deeply invested in controlling Afghanistan, often trying to do so by installing and backing a compliant ruler, a puppet king like Shah Shuja.
Okay. Centuries ago.
Yeah. Now, fast forward centuries to the post-Cold War era, and what do we see? The United States similarly attempting to exert influence, often through close proxy rulers like Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani.
So, the flags on the map change, the empires rise and fall, but the core tactic external powers, trying to manage Afghanistan through internal proxies, that pattern remains remarkably consistent.
Precisely, and that's the key takeaway the source emphasizes. History isn't just a list of past events, it's a teacher, showing us these enduring patterns of behavior, of power dynamics, of strategic challenges. And understanding these patterns can offer valuable, perhaps even predictive, insights into how events might unfold today or tomorrow.
And for you listening right now, maybe sitting there reading the news, why does seeing this pattern, this deep historical echo in a place like Afghanistan or any region actually matter to you?
Yeah, why should you care?
It's because understanding these recurring dynamics gives you a much deeper lens than just looking at the latest headline. It helps you see the deeper forces and historical logic shaping current events, maybe even helping you anticipate potential next steps.
It elevates your understanding from just what is happening to why it is happening and how this fits into a much larger story. It gives you that depth.
That brings us to another core concept the source introduces, fundamental to this whole journey: international society. This sounds a bit academic, maybe even counterintuitive if we think of the world as just states pursuing their own interests.
Well, let's unpack that. First, let's think about the idea of society generally. Any group of people living together, from a small community to a large nation, operates based on certain rules, practices, shared understandings that govern how they interact.
Right. Sure. Makes sense.
And societies don't exist in a vacuum. They interact with other societies. The source notes that interaction between distinct human groups has been happening since, well, the earliest times.
Since forever, basically.
Pretty much. The idea of an international society emerges when these interactions between distinct political communities become bound by shared rules, norms, and institutions. It's when states, while remaining independent, recognize certain common interests and values that lead them to establish structures and practices for managing their relationships, rather than existing in total isolation or constant, unfettered conflict.
Okay, so it's more than just contact. It's contact governed by something shared, something agreed upon, like rules of the road.
Sort of, yeah, exactly. And the source concludes that the presence of international societies is absolutely crucial for understanding of the course of history and politics. They arise when nations or political communities associate with each other based on shared values, common rules, and mutual interests. Now, the source makes an important point about the concept's origins. While the idea of interactions between societies is ancient, the concept of an international society as a theoretical framework, particularly in modern IR, owes its most significant development to the interactions among European nation-states.
Okay, so it starts in Europe, mainly.
That's where the modern concept really takes shape. However, the source emphasizes that this concept is now understood to apply to the diverse political communities interacting across the globe in the post-Cold War world, far beyond just Europe.
Right, it's global now. Then the source brings in the work of Hedley Bull here. What light does he shed on this?
Hedley Bull, yes, a key scholar in this area. He offered a perspective that, as the source presents it, is quite profound, actually.
Yeah.
He argued that when a group of states, despite their differences, share enough common interests and values to form a society bound by common rules of interaction, they are simultaneously living with a fundamental reality. There is no power higher than themselves.
No world government.
No global government. No ultimate authority above sovereign states. This situation, the absence of an overarching ruler, is what we mean by anarchy in international relations.
So it's not necessarily chaos and disorder, but a society operating within anarchy. That feels a bit counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? And that's the key insight. Bull's point, echoed in the source, is that you can have an ordered anarchy.
You're at anarchy.
States can exist in a system without a central government, anarchy, while still developing shared rules, norms, and institutions, society, to manage their interactions. Think of it like neighbors on a street. There's no single street boss, right? That's anarchy. But they might still agree on things like not playing loud music after 10 p.m. or respecting property lines. That's the society part. They cooperate where their interests align and compete where they don't, all without a higher authority enforcing everything.
Okay, I get that analogy.
And the source notes that the proper origin of this specific idea of international society, especially tied to the sovereign state system we see today, is firmly rooted in Europe, particularly emerging strongly after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
Westphalia, that date comes up a lot.
It's pivotal. This isn't just a dry historical date. This treaty, or rather series of treaties, was a watershed moment. It saw the rise of a new European state system founded on core ideas that knitted these emerging nations together. The principle of state sovereignty.
Meaning states are top dog in their own territory.
Exactly. Supreme authority within their borders. Then, non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. And the idea of states being legally equal, at least in principle, regardless of their size or power.
Westphalia sounds like the moment the foundational architecture of the modern world was really put in place.
Absolutely. The system that solidified in Europe after 1648 didn't just pave the way for modern diplomacy. It fundamentally restructured the political map and the way international relations operated, laying the essential groundwork for the international order we inhabit today. It's huge.
All right, so we understand why history matters and what international society means in this context. Now, let's dive into that sweep of history the source outlines, starting in the very ancient world. Where does the source begin our journey?
Okay, so our exploration starts with the rise of successive civilizations. We're moving beyond the prehistory of hunter-gatherers, primarily because, as the source notes, we lack the historical records from that truly ancient time.
Not enough written down.
Exactly. Our evidence for structured interaction really begins with the emergence of more complex societies, cities, kingdoms.
And what's the big takeaway from looking at these earliest periods? Did they even have international relations?
Well, that's the key insight. International diplomacy wasn't something invented in modern times. The source makes it clear that it did exist, even thousands of years ago.
Really?
Oh, yeah. These ancient civilizations conducted their foreign affairs according to well-defined policies. Many elements we associate with modern international diplomacy were already present. They formed alliances, signed treaties, pursued their self-interest, thought strategically about their interactions, exchanged diplomatic envoys, asserted dominance, hegemony, and navigated constantly shifting conditions. It was all there in early forms.
And the source points to some incredibly early examples.
It does, showing just how deep the roots go. We find traces of diplomacy as far back as 3000 BC in Mesopotamia.
Wow.
And there's evidence of a recorded peace treaty from around 2300 BC between the Ebla, king of Syria, and the king of Assyrians.
That's over 4,000 years ago. Formal agreements between distinct political entities existed that far back.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
But they weren't nation-states like we have today, right?
No, and the source makes that distinction clear. Compared to the modern state system, ancient civilizations generally lacked features like strictly defined and internationally recognized territorial boundaries, or the core principles of legal equality and sovereignty as we understand them today.
So different kind of political units.
Exactly. City-states, empires, kingdoms, they operated under different organizing principles.
How did the need for diplomacy even emerge in these early human communities? What drove it?
The source links it to fundamental economic and social shifts. As humans transitioned from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agricultural life, communities grew, developed greater internal economic complexity.
Farming changed everything.
It did. And this naturally led to a need for trade with other communities or regions to acquire goods they didn't produce themselves.
Right. Got to get stuff you don't have.
Exactly. This contact through trade spurred ambitions among the leaders, the territory controllers or early kings, to extend their influence or control over more land and resources. Now, warfare was always an option for resolving disputes or expanding territory.
Sure.
But negotiation through diplomatic envoys and formalized treaties emerged as a crucial alternative, a way to achieve goals or manage relations without constant conflict. Peace, sometimes, was more profitable.
A peaceful alternative. And there's that really fascinating detail the source includes about ancient diplomacy being not just monarchical, but linked to divine powers. That's different.
Oh, very different. This is a striking feature that sets it apart from modern secular diplomacy. Power was typically concentrated in the figure of the king, right?
Yeah, the king's the boss.
And often, the king's authority was underpinned by a belief in his divine connection, or even divine nature. This belief manifested in how diplomacy was conducted.
How so?
Take the example from the ancient Middle East mentioned in the source. Kings would sign treaties covering practical matters, border access, grazing rights, trade.
Mundane stuff.
Seemingly mundane. But these weren't just bureaucratic procedures. They were often accompanied by elaborate ceremonies and rituals. Diplomats were the agents who concluded these agreements. But here's the unique part. These treaties often included detailed procedures for addressing violations.
Penalties.
And critically, violating a treaty was perceived to carry divine retributions. Treaties were believed to have been sanctioned by the gods.
Whoa. So breaking a treaty wasn't just a political problem. It was like inviting divine wrath. A spiritual danger.
Exactly. It added this whole layer of transcendental consequence to international agreements.
Yes.
You weren't just angering another king, you were potentially angering the gods.
That's a powerful enforcement mechanism.
You bet. And while modern diplomacy is ostensibly secular, the source offers a powerful, maybe surprising modern illustration of how echoes of this historical mindset can persist in rhetoric.
Oh, yeah.
Remember in January 2016, following the execution of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr in Saudi Arabia, the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, warned Saudi Arabia of divine revenge.
I remember that, yes.
That threat, framed in terms of divine retribution for a political act, is a chilling modern echo of those ancient beliefs about divine sanctions on earthly affairs and international conduct.
Wow.
It shows how deep historical patterns of thought can linger in political language and threats today, particularly in certain cultural contexts. History isn't always ancient history.
That connection between ancient divine sanctions and modern rhetoric is a perfect example of those historical patterns showing up. Amazing. Let's pivot now to specific examples the source provides from the ancient world, starting with ancient India and the ideas found in Kautilya's Arthashastra.
Right, ancient India. It had its own sophisticated tradition of statecraft and diplomacy, often intertwined with religious norms, elaborate courtly rituals.
Very complex.
Very. While the idea of envoys is mentioned in very early texts like the Rig Veda, the establishment of formal diplomatic missions appears later. But for a deep dive into ancient Indian political thought and its approach to foreign policy, the scholar Kautilya and his monumental work, the Arthashastra, are absolutely indispensable, as the source highlights.
Arthashastra. What's the core idea there?
The Arthashastra presents a worldview that is Strikingly pragmatic, almost, well, ruthless. Its core tenets, as described, are that self-interest is the absolute driving force of diplomacy and statecraft, and that the state is the primary actor in politics,
Sounds familiar.
doesn't it? The source makes a direct and compelling comparison here, noting that these very ideas are remarkably similar to the core notions put forward by modern realists in international relations theory.
So Kautilya was essentially articulating a form of realism thousands of years ago, like an ancient Machiavelli or something.
In essence, yes. That's a good comparison. The fundamental principle in the Arthashastra is that every state acts to maximize its own power and self-interest. Kautilya argued that any alliance between two states, say State A and State B, isn't formed out of friendship or shared values in a deep sense.
No warm fuzzies.
No. It's based purely on what each state calculates it can gain from that alliance. Even actions that might look altruistic from a state, according to this perspective, have an underlying calculation of self-interest somewhere. It's all about the state's gain.
And alliances were central to this self-interested strategy.
Crucially so. They were formed for very concrete, self-serving reasons. Acquiring territory, gaining control of uninhabited but potentially valuable areas, forming a coalition to crush a rival power, or simply for defense when necessary.
Practical reasons.
Very practical. These alliances were formalized through elaborate treaties signed by the king, which, despite the underlying self-interest, were meant to be binding.
Binding, but still based on self-interest.
Exactly. But the Arthashastra is perhaps most famous for its mandala theory of foreign policy.
Mandala theory. Okay, what's that?
This theory describes a state's geopolitical neighborhood in a stark adversarial way. Your immediate neighbor is considered your natural enemy.
Your neighbor is your enemy. Ouch!
Yeah. And logically, the neighbor of your enemy is your natural ally. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Ah, that old saying.
It's basically codified here. The source even points out that some observers see echoes of this ancient theory influencing aspects of India's bilateral relations in contemporary times, for example, in its approach to countries like Afghanistan, which is a neighbor of its traditional rival, Pakistan.
That's a very cynical and conflict-prone view of geography, isn't it?
It is, but it's born from a highly strategic, survival-oriented perspective. And perhaps the most revealing aspect of the source details is Kautilya's view on the relationship between diplomacy and war.
Okay.
He didn't see them as completely separate realms. Diplomacy, in his framework, is a subtle act of aggression.
Wow. Diplomacy as aggression.
Yes. Its purpose is to weaken your potential enemy and gain advantage for yourself, with the ultimate goal often being outright conquest.
So diplomacy isn't always about preventing war. It can be a tool leading to war or part of the strategy for war.
Exactly. It's a means to an end. And that end is often the increase of the state's power, potentially through military victory. It's all part of the same toolkit.
And the role of the ambassador, the diplomat, what about them?
Also seen through this pragmatic, even cynical lens, Arthashastra gives special mention to ambassadors, viewing them not just as official messengers, but as potential spies operating under diplomatic immunity.
Diplomats as spies.
Absolutely. Their critical function was to gather intelligence, all the inside information they could about the foreign kingdom they were in, and report it back to their ruler. Information is power.
That makes sense in that framework.
Totally. And Kautilya's foreign policy advice was ultimately rooted in expediency and the assessment of power. Simple calculation.
How so?
He advised that if a domestic king was weaker than a neighboring king, the wise policy was to maintain peace. Don't pick a fight you can't win.
Makes sense.
However, if the domestic king was stronger, then foreign policy should be aggressively driven by the aim of war and ultimately conquest. Use your strength.
Power dictates strategy. Peace from weakness, war from strength. A very clear, if ruthless, logic.
It is. The Arthashastra provides this incredibly comprehensive framework, clearly asserting state self-interest as the absolute core guiding principle for foreign policy, detailing how alliances, treaties, diplomacy, even espionage all serve these interests, often in service of expansionist or security goals. It's hardcore realism, millennia ago.
From that intensely realist perspective in ancient India, let's turn to ancient China. The source suggests a different philosophical foundation there, more cooperative.
Well, the approach to international relations in ancient China, as described, was notably different from India or Greece. It was deeply rooted in a belief in cultural superiority.
Okay, different angle.
Yeah. The Chinese saw themselves as occupying the central and highest position in a cultural hierarchy among nations, the Middle Kingdom idea. Interactions were often framed through this hierarchical rather than equal lens.
Right.
The key figure the source highlights here, whose ideas inform the analysis of ancient Chinese foreign policy, is Sun Tzu,
The legendary military strategist, author of The Art of War.
the very one. But paradoxically, perhaps, Sun's series, as presented, suggests a focus on relations between particularly great powers based on principles of cooperation and trust.
Cooperation and Trust, from the author of The Art of War.
I know, it sounds odd, right? But the source draws a comparison here to the ideals often associated with modern liberalism in foreign policy, contrasting it sharply with Kautilya's realism.
Interesting. So what about war then?
Well, Sun Tzu, despite writing the definitive text on warfare, famously emphasized achieving victory without direct confrontation. He rejected the idea of using brute force as the primary tool of war.
Okay.
He favored instead warfare by deception, the ultimate aim being to subdue the enemy without fighting a pitched battle, get them to give up without bloodshed if possible.
Winning without fighting, that sounds like the ultimate strategic goal. Maximum efficiency.
It is. It emphasizes strategic maneuvering, psychological operations, disrupting the enemy's plans, understanding their weaknesses, and creating conditions where they yield without the need for a costly military engagement.
Smart.
Very. The source includes a quote from Sun Tzu's The Art of War that captures this. When capable, reign in activity. When active, inactivity.
Meaning?
It speaks to the strategic use of appearance versus reality, making your opponent believe you are weak or inactive when you are strong and poised and vice versa. Deception, basically, to gain a decisive advantage without confrontation.
Clever.
And Sun Tzu also articulated the need for what the source terms competitive diplomacy. He argued that a nation needed a well-defined strategy for both diplomacy and war to effectively manage and ultimately remove conflict.
So diplomacy and war are still linked, but maybe differently than in Kautilya.
Yeah, it seems less about diplomacy as aggression and more about having strategies for both domains. A country that lacked a strategy in either of these areas, he believed, risked being easily dominated or made captive by a nation that possessed a clear, integrated strategy.
You need a plan for both peace and war.
Exactly. So, while emphasizing cooperation and trust, there's still a strong undercurrent of strategic competition and preparedness in the Chinese approach described here. Ultimately, ancient China's focus, according to the source, was on cultivating cooperation and trust in diplomacy, but always backed by strategic depth and the potential for clever indirect action.
Okay, fascinating contrast. Moving from those Eastern traditions, let's look west to ancient Greece. The source points to an early example of the concept of the balance of power appearing here. That's usually linked to modern Europe, isn't it?
It usually is, yes, but Greece is a particularly interesting case from the ancient world because it provides tangible examples not only of alliances being formed, leagues of city-states banding together, but crucially of instances where alliances shifted quite deliberately with the explicit goal of maintaining a balance of power among the various political entities. So while the concept is strongly associated with modern European history, the source highlights its clear presence in ancient Greek statecraft. It wasn't just theory, they were doing it.
Okay. Tell us about the Greek setup, city-states. Right.
Right. The Greek political landscape was dominated by numerous city-states. These were independent political units, varying greatly in their internal governance, some monarchies, some aristocracies, some oligarchies.
Well, it's a variety.
Yeah, but they shared common cultural elements like religion and language, the Hellenic identity.
Yeah.
Importantly, though, unlike modern states, they were independent, but not founded on the principle of legal equality in their interactions. Power mattered.
Got it. And the source focuses on two main players.
It focuses on two of the most powerful and influential city-states, Sparta and Athens. They were the superpowers of their day, in a way.
How did Sparta demonstrate the exercise of power through alliances? What was their strategy?
Sparta provides a clear illustration. Geographically, Athens was to Sparta's north, and to its south were various Peloponnesian city-states. Now, Sparta had a significant internal issue, a large population of subjugated lower classes known as helots.
The helots, right, a potential problem.
A huge potential problem. There was a constant fear that the southern states might incite the helots to revolt, causing chaos within Sparta.
So internal security drove foreign policy.
Absolutely. To secure itself against this internal threat, Sparta built and maintained a network of alliances throughout the Peloponnesian Peninsula, the Peloponnesian League. It exercised influence over these ostensibly independent states, ensuring they would not support or utilize the helots against Sparta.
Kind of like a sphere of influence.
Pretty much. These Peloponnesian states were given a degree of liberty by Sparta, but were expected to provide military support in times of crisis. This alliance system was Sparta's primary security strategy, ensuring its dominance and stability at home.
And Athens' approach. Different threats, different strategy.
Exactly. Athens faced a different, but equally existential threat: repeated invasions from the vast Persian Empire to the east.
The Persians, big enemy.
Huge. To counter this, Athens formed the Delian League, an alliance comprising around 200 city-states, mostly islands and coastal cities, that were also vulnerable to Persian attacks. Through this collective security arrangement, Athens managed the significant menace posed by Persia and also built its own maritime empire in the process.
Okay, so alliances for external defense. But it wasn't just Sparta versus Athens, right?
Not at all. The source also notes that the balance of power wasn't just a bipolar dynamic. Other powerful city-states like Corinth, Thebes, and Argos also played crucial roles, shifting allegiances and capabilities within the broader Greek system. They were important secondary powers.
And we see those shifting alliances to maintain the balance of power the source mentioned, like actual example.
Absolutely, clear examples.
Yeah.
After Athens was defeated by Sparta in the Major Peloponnesian War, ending in 404 BC, Sparta emerged as the dominant power, the hegemon. Right. But the other Greek states weren't happy about this. To check Sparta's growing power and prevent its total dominance, a coalition formed against it. The Corinthians, the Thebans, and even the previously defeated Athenians allied against Sparta.
The former enemies teamed up.
Exactly, to balance against the new threat. Later, external pressures and diplomatic efforts led to peace treaties specifically aimed at curbing Spartan power and restoring a measure of balance. This dynamic, the rise of a dominant power and the formation of counter-coalitions to prevent hegemony, is a hallmark of balance of power politics, clearly evident in ancient Greece.
Fascinating. So, looking across these very different ancient worlds, India, China, Greece, what does the source say are the common threads, the enduring features of diplomacy we find, despite all the differences?
Well, despite the vast differences in culture, geography, political structure, the source identifies several core features of international interaction present across these examples.
So like what?
The formation of alliances, that's universal. The fundamental pursuit of state self-interest, even if framed differently, like China's focus on cooperation built on underlying strength, it's still about the state's position.
Okay.
The importance of cooperation as a tool, even for realists like Kautilya. The assertion of hegemonic power, and the inevitable reaction against it, the balance of power dynamic we saw in Greece, and the crucial role of treaties in formalizing relationships.
So these basic elements keep cropping up.
They do. The source emphasizes that these fundamental elements didn't disappear with the ancient world, but continued in varying degrees and evolving forms right into the medieval and modern periods. The toolkit was already being assembled.
Okay, so from the decline of those great ancient empires, particularly Rome, what happened to international relations in the medieval period? Did things just stop?
Not stop, but definitely changed. With the fragmentation of the ancient empires, especially in the West, the kings who succeeded them had significantly less centralized power compared to, say, the Roman emperors.
Power got spread out.
Exactly. Power became increasingly decentralized and seized by landowning nobles, the aristocracy, who asserted their local superiority. This gave rise to the system we know as feudalism in Europe.
Feudalism, lords and vassals.
Right. Nobles controlled the land and commanded their own armed forces. Kings became dependent on these powerful nobles for military support and resources, as the royal treasury and standing army were often limited. The king was often just the biggest noble, in effect.
How did this feudal structure shape medieval society and its interactions with the outside world? Was there much international interaction?
Medieval society in Europe, particularly Western Europe, was relatively closed, hierarchical, and dominated by the power of the nobles. Economic activity was largely localized, focused on commodity production within the lord's domain for immediate needs, with limited surplus for long-distance trade. Villages were often more self-sufficient. Very insular. Villages were often more developed in some ways than the nascent towns and cities. For international relations study, the source notes the focus during this period is primarily on the interactions within and between the remnants and successors of the Roman Empire, particularly the West and Eastern Rome, Byzantium.
So, less interaction overall.
True international diplomacy, in the sense of robust, continuous engagement between numerous independent political entities like we saw hints of before, didn't flourish as it would later. The source attributes this largely to Europe's relative isolation and fragmentation during what's often termed the Dark Ages.
Why Dark Ages?
Well, It was a period marked by feudalism, frequent invasions, internal wars, and later the Crusades. It was a transitional era, and the source pinpoints 1453, the fall of Constantinople, as a symbolic date associated with the decline of this medieval order.
1453 again. Seems important. The source provides a specific timeline for the Roman Empire's influence across this long period, right?
Yes, it traces Rome's span from its traditional founding in 753 BC to the fall of its eastern half in 1453 AD. That's over 2,000 years of influence in some form.
Incredible longevity.
It is. Initially, Rome was a republic, 509-27 BC, then an empire ruled by emperors from 27 BC onwards. The empire reached its peak territorial extent around 117 AD, but the sheer scale of governing this vast territory became challenging.
Too big to manage.
Pretty much. This led Emperor Diocletian to split it into Western and Eastern administrations in 285 AD. From this point, Western and Eastern Rome followed increasingly divergent historical paths.
And those paths led to very different fates. One falls, one carries on.
Indeed. Western Rome faced immense pressure. Around 410 AD, it was significantly impacted by invasions from various Germanic barbarian groups, like the Visigoths sacking Rome itself.
Right, the fall of Rome.
Well, the fall of the Western Empire. It was already weakened by prolonged conflicts, notably with the Sassanid Persians in the east. Western Rome's economic and military strength waned dramatically. This led to its gradual decline and fragmentation, ushering in that period of reduced complexity and isolation, the Dark Ages in Western Europe, lasting roughly 500 years, until around the 10th century.
And the Pope?
The Pope managed to consolidate his religious presence and some secular influence during this time, but his authority was geographically and politically limited compared to later periods.
So the West fragments. What about the East, Byzantium?
Eastern Rome, the Byzantine Empire, had a different experience initially. Its capital, Constantinople, was strategically located at a massive hub for trade between Europe and Asia.
Location, location, location.
Absolutely. And the land was more resource-rich. Byzantine rulers were able to consolidate their power and implement significant institutional reforms, maintaining a more centralized and functional state while the West fragmented. They kept the Roman legacy alive, in a sense.
So why did the Byzantine Empire eventually collapse then, in 1453?
Well, the source points to a confluence of factors.
Yeah.
Long, slow decline, really.
Yeah.
Firstly, the Byzantines' relative strength and stability sparked jealousy and interference from powers in the West, particularly the Pope.
West versus East rivalry.
Yep. Seeking to create a counterweight, the Popes crowned Charlemagne as emperor in the West in 800 AD. These political rivalries contributed to a major religious split in 1054 AD, the Great Schism,
The church splits.
dividing the Christian church into Roman Catholicism in the West and Orthodox Christianity in the East. A huge break. This schism was compounded by destructive internal imperial feuds within the Byzantine Empire over succession and power,
Internal problems.
always weak in an empire. This diverted resources and attention inwards, preventing the Byzantines from mounting a unified defense against external threats, specifically the westward expansion of the Seljuk Turks.
The Seljuks.
The first major blow came with the Seljuk victory at the Battle of Manzikert in 1076 AD. That's widely seen as the beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire.
Start of the decline.
Exactly. Its long decline culminated centuries later, in 1453 AD, when the Ottomans, who succeeded the Seljuks, captured Constantinople, bringing the Eastern Roman Empire to a final end.
So the medieval world order was this complex, fragmented picture in the West with feudal lords and a powerful church, and a more consolidated but eventually declining empire in the East. Is that a fair summary?
Precisely. In Western Europe, it was a complex web of authority between the papacy, various monarchies, and powerful nobles. The church, particularly the papacy, played a significant role in attempting to set moral and behavioral norms, and for a period, the papacy held considerable political influence. However, the source notes, this dominant role of the Pope would significantly decline later with the rise of strong centralized states and absolute monarchies. That's the next chapter.
Okay, that brings us to the period leading into modern Europe and the birth of the nation-state system that would come to dominate the globe. How did that medieval order start to crumble, and what were the forces that replaced it? It sounds like a huge shift.
It was a massive transformation driven by several interconnected forces. The Crusades, for all their religious motivations, had a significant unintended consequence.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
They increased contact between Europeans and the cultures of the East, the Byzantine world, the Middle East. Europeans came back with a taste for luxurious commodities from the Far East, silks, spices, exotic goods.
Developed expensive taste.
They did. This growing demand among the European nobility and wealthy spurred a need for increased production back home, putting pressure on the feudal system to generate surplus goods for trade. This economic pressure, coupled with the desire for wealth beyond the confines of the village, encouraged the poor to seek new opportunities.
So a desire for luxuries helped kickstart economic change, broke down the old system.
It was a key factor, yeah. This desire and the need for increased production led people to develop new skills and, crucially, to migrate from the rural manners to burgeoning towns and cities.
Urbanization starts.
Exactly. These urban centers became hubs for trade and craft production, fostering the rise of a new social class, the merchant class or burghers. This commercial revolution led to increased overall production and wealth accumulation, not in the hands of the nobility or the church, but in this new middle class.
A new power base.
A totally new power base. A new economic and social system was clearly taking shape, challenging the old feudal hierarchy. Trade with the East flourished through existing routes until
1453. That date again, it wasn't just the end of an empire, it was a turning point for trade routes.
Exactly. The Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire, and, just as importantly for this story, giving them control over the major overland trade routes between Europe and Asia.
Cut off the supply.
Or at least made it much more difficult and expensive. Europeans, who had developed a strong appetite for Asian luxuries, were now faced with disruption and higher costs. This spurred an urgent and ambitious search for new ways to reach the East, bypassing the Ottoman-controlled routes. This desperation directly fueled the age of geographical discoveries.
The voyages of Columbus, da Gama, etc.
Precisely. Seeking new routes to the riches of the East. And these discoveries had a huge feedback effect back in Europe.
Massive, I bet.
Oh, yeah. The geographical discoveries were powered by, and, in turn, empowered the new merchant class. They financed voyages, accumulated enormous wealth from new trade in spices, silver, eventually slaves, and their influence grew dramatically.
Challenging the old guard.
They began challenging the power of the traditional elites, the nobles, the church, and sought control in the growing municipalities and even state power. The ambition to explore and reach new territories was driven by the potent combination of the desire for trade and the intellectual curiosity sparked by the Renaissance.
The Renaissance, right. That's happening too.
Absolutely. This period, propelled by the Renaissance's intellectual awakening and the geographical discoveries, truly represented a rebirth and reorientation of Europe. But there was another earth-shattering development during this era.
What's that?
Gunpowder. The invention and spread of gunpowder.
Ah, okay. How did gunpowder redraw the lines of political power? Castles aren't so great anymore.
Exactly. It fundamentally altered the balance of power within states. In the feudal system, kings relied heavily on their nobles to provide armed knights and soldiers. Gunpowder changed the technology of warfare. Castles became vulnerable to cannon, and rulers could equip and train their own infantry forces, armed with firearms, loyal directly to the crown. Kings were no longer dependent on the nobility for their military strength.
That's a game changer.
Huge game changer. This instantly diminished the political and military relevance of the feudal aristocracy. Kings skillfully used this new technology to consolidate their armies and centralize their authority.
Making themselves stronger, the nobles weaker.
Precisely. And the source notes that these consolidating monarchs were smart. They recognized the power of the rising middle class, actively promoted trade and commerce, and patronized these new economic actors. In doing so, they actively dismantled the old medieval social order, replacing it with a new system based on centralized royal power and commercial wealth, rather than feudal landholding.
A whole new world emerging. Alongside these political and economic shifts, there was a major religious earthquake, the Reformation. How does that fit in?
Yes, the Reformation. And its roots are deeply connected to the broader European transformation we've been talking about.
Oh, so.
The Renaissance and geographical discoveries fueled trade and the growth of cities, attracting people seeking new opportunities and intellectual stimulation. This intellectual revolution, emphasizing reason and challenging received wisdom, naturally extended to questioning the authority of the dominant medieval institution, the Catholic Church.
People started thinking for themselves more.
You could say that. And the invention of the printing press was absolutely crucial here.
The printing press.
It wasn't just a technology, it was a revolution in communication. It made classical texts available more widely and cheaply, reinforcing the Renaissance spirit. But crucially, it also facilitated the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages, German, English, French.
So people could read it themselves, not just the priests.
Exactly. Previously, it was mainly in Latin. As ordinary people read the Bible, they began to question various practices and doctrines of the church even more critically. Does it actually say that?
What were the consequences of this intellectual and religious ferment for the church's power? It sounds like a perfect storm for them.
It really was. The source points to two significant outcomes impacting the church's position. Firstly, the rise of urban life affected the church financially. People in cities were more focused on their livelihoods, worldly affairs, maybe paid less attention or had less surplus for the church.
Less money flowing in.
Less money for the church hierarchy, which was in constant need of funds for its own projects and administration. Secondly, monarchs were becoming less reliant on the church to legitimize or maintain their power.
They had gunpowder and merchants now.
All right. The commercial revolution incentivized kings to support the merchant class and trade to build their own power base. Many felt less need to use the church for state power and didn't want to risk using the church to suppress this economically vital new social order. Plus, the church's authority had already been weakened by earlier events like the Great Schism in 1054. Cracks were already showing.
And this is the environment into which Martin Luther stepped, ready to light the fuse.
Precisely. The printing press allowed Luther's ideas to spread like wildfire. The immediate trigger, as the source explains, was Pope Leo X's need for vast funds to complete St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome.
Big building project.
Huge! This led him to authorize the aggressive sale of indulgences, essentially, certificates offering forgiveness of sins or release from purgatory, a practice conceptually linked to the sacrifices of the Crusades. Pay money, get time off purgatory.
Seems iffy.
Luther thought so too. In 1517, Martin Luther famously posted his 95 Theses, questioning the theological and rational basis of selling indulgences, sparking a massive public debate facilitated by the printing press.
A debate that spiraled into a fracture of Western Christianity.
Exactly. The debate led to demands for fundamental religious reforms and ultimately resulted in a permanent split within Western Christianity, giving rise to Protestantism alongside Catholicism.
And this led to war.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
This religious division became intertwined with political power struggles and eventually erupted into devastating conflicts across Europe, most notably the 30 Years' War, which ravaged Germany.
A horrible war.
Terrible. The source notes that this religious question, which had torn Europe apart, was finally settled once and for all, at least in terms of states deciding their own religious affairs internally, by the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Back to Westphalia again.
Westphalia seems to be the answer to everything in this period. So these immense forces, the Renaissance, Reformation, geographical discoveries, the rise of consolidated monarchies leveraging gunpowder, how did they specifically reshape international relations? What changed on the world stage?
Their collective impact was transformative, huge. The Age of Discovery created a new global spatial awareness, this sense of a bigger world, and spurred intense interest in mapping and cartography. Where is everything? Who owns it? It also powerfully emphasized the importance of acquiring territory and, crucially, establishing strictly defined boundaries between political entities. This idea of lines on a map becoming really important.
Borders matter now.
Big time.
Good.
And the concept of the balance of power, which we saw glimpses of in ancient Greece, was now explicitly adopted as a core instrument of statecraft, a deliberate tool used by states to prevent any single power from dominating the others, giving conscious policy. The rise of centralized states, often under absolute monarchs, introduced the powerful new doctrine of sovereign independence. Each state asserted its supreme authority within its own territory. This ushered Europe into a new phase of competition and conflict, driven by the competing interests of these newly sovereign entities.
So more defined states, more competition between them. Let's return to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 one more time, because the source emphasizes its foundational contribution to modern IR. What exactly did it do for international relations?
Right, Westphalia. It wasn't a single treaty, but a series of interconnected peace agreements negotiated over several years, ending the 30 Years' War in 1648. It did several critical things that reshaped Europe and eventually the world, as the source details.
Lay it out for us.
Okay. Firstly, it ended that ruinous 30 Years' War, finally settling the major religious conflicts that had bled Europe dry.
Peace, finally.
Relatively speaking. It established the clear right of rulers to determine the religion practiced within their own state, curius regio, ius religio, effectively stating there would be no papal interference in the internal religious affairs of states.
Big blow to the Pope's power.
Huge blow to the Church's transnational political authority. By recognizing the ruler's right to decide their subjects' religion, it was a fundamental acknowledgement of state sovereignty. the state's supreme authority within its borders.
Sovereignty enshrined.
Yes. It also formally recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic from Spain. Small state, big principle. It laid some of the groundwork for the idea of national self-determination, implying that peoples had a right to their own state.
Seeds of nationalism.
Possibly. It set a crucial precedent. Peace could be achieved through a diplomatic congress of states negotiating as equals, not through the imposition of authority by an emperor or the pope. States talking to states.
New way of making peace.
And most famously, it founded the principle of Westphalian sovereignty, a system of coexisting sovereign states, primarily in Central Europe initially. Within this system, interstate aggression was to be checked not by a higher authority, but by the states themselves employing the mechanism of the balance of power.
The states police themselves, kind of?
In theory, and a core norm emerged from this, the principle of non-interference in another state's domestic affairs. What happens inside your borders is your business.
And the impact of these Westphalian principles spread far beyond Europe, didn't it? It wasn't just a European thing eventually.
Absolutely, that's key. As European powers expanded their influence globally through colonization and trade over the next centuries, these Westphalian principles, particularly the concept of the sovereign state, territorial integrity, and non-interference, became the absolute bedrock of modern international law and the prevailing world order that emerged and persists to this day. It created the template for what a state is and how states should, in theory, interact globally.
So this is the DNA of the modern world system.
Pretty much. The source also notes that subsequent major conflicts actually served to reinforce these Westphalian principles. Take the War of Spanish Succession, starting around 1700.
What was that about?
It wasn't just about who got the Spanish throne after the king died childless. It was primarily driven by the concern of other European powers, Britain, Austria, the Dutch, to maintain the balance of power and prevent a single entity, like a combined France and Spain under a Bourbon king, from becoming too dominant.
Stop one power getting too strong.
Exactly. The succession became a matter of international concern requiring external agreement. The war concluded with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which explicitly recognized the principle of the balance of power as a key factor in European stability. It was written into the treaty.
So the states were learning how to play the game within the new rules Westphalia had set. It became accepted practice.
Precisely. And fueled by the consolidated power of monarchs and the new wealth generated by trade and discovery, their energies turned increasingly outwards. This drive to explore, conquer, and acquire resources for the burgeoning commercial and intellectual revolution, ironically, helped stabilize Europe internally, maybe, by giving this outward outlet for ambition and conflict.
Exporting conflict.
Possibly. And it was during this period that modern diplomacy truly came into its own as a central feature of international life.
How so?
States operating under the logic of distinct territories and sovereign interests became inextricably linked. Actions by one state, trade policies, alliances, territorial claims directly affected others. This interdependence necessitated a way to manage relations, leading to the explicit adoption of the balance of power and, crucially, the realization that states needed open channels for communication and negotiation. Constant dialogue.
Which led to the rise of permanent diplomatic missions.
Embassies. Exactly. States realized the need for a constant, reliable path for information flow and dialogue with other states, beyond just sending messengers for specific issues. This paved the way for the establishment of permanent ambassadors residing in foreign capitals, playing a continuous and vital role in managing relations, gathering intelligence, and maintaining the balance of power in European international politics.
The eyes and ears of the king abroad.
Right. And the source includes a fascinating historical footnote about who these first modern diplomats often were.
Oh, who?
Kings, needing to find new roles for the old, increasingly less powerful nobility, the ones whose castles weren't so useful anymore, often appointed them as their representatives abroad, gave them something prestigious to do.
Keep the nobles happy.
Maybe. But it gave an air of eliteness to diplomacy, a legacy that the source notes is still, perhaps subtly, visible in the practice of 21st century diplomacy. This era marked the true birth of a professional diplomatic service.
Interesting social angle.
And importantly, the nature of treaties changed. They were no longer based on divine sanctions like in the ancient world. They were increasingly based on agreements reached between sovereign entities according to the developing principles of international law, secular legal agreements.
So this period, from the Renaissance to the early 18th century, Treaty of Utrecht was absolutely foundational, set everything up.
It really was. The source summarizes the period from roughly 1453 to 1713, from the fall of Constantinople to the Treaty of Utrecht, as the era that introduced stability in Europe, albeit a stability achieved through the constant management of competition. And it solidified the core principles of modern international society: state sovereignty, the norm of non-intervention, the establishment of permanent diplomatic institutions, the conscious practice of the balance of power, and the development of international law. All the key pieces were on the board.
Okay. And while all these political and economic transformations were underway, what about the intellectual landscape? The source brings in the Age of Enlightenment. How does that fit?
Right, the Enlightenment. As trade expanded dramatically via the new sea routes, it quickly outpaced the financial capabilities of individual merchants. This spurred the need for more organized forms of finance, leading to the rise of joint stock companies, pooling capital.
Like the East India companies.
Exactly, those kinds of entities. Following the geographical discoveries and fueled by the spirit of the Renaissance came the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century. This was a powerful intellectual and cultural movement that emphasized reason, individualism, and skepticism towards traditional authority, including religious and monarchical authority.
Question everything.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
It had a profound impact on European society, encouraging free thinking, critical inquiry, and intellectuals sought to build societal foundations based on logic and empirical observation, not just tradition or divine right.
And this had consequences for politics and IR?
Oh, huge consequences. The Enlightenment had two major consequences that directly impacted the trajectory of European history and, by extension, international relations. Firstly, it provided the intellectual fuel for major political revolutions.
Like the American Revolution.
The American Revolution is a prime example. Heavily influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like Locke, Jefferson, Montesquieu, Paine, advocating for natural rights, separation of powers, self-governance.
Right.
In 1776, America becomes a republic, breaking away from a monarchy. And its existence and ideals had significant external repercussions. It helped inspire the French Revolution.
1789. Liberty, equality, fraternity.
Exactly. Those ideals resonated across Europe, profoundly impacting political thought and movements well into the 20th century. The idea that people could overthrow kings and create their own government was radical.
Okay, so political revolution, what was the second consequence?
Secondly, the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, experimentation, and the application of knowledge directly spurred innovation in a different sphere: production. It provided a strong impetus for the Industrial Revolution.
How did thinking lead to factories?
The application of scientific thinking and rational inquiry, encouraged by the Enlightenment, paved the way for inventors and entrepreneurs to develop modern industrial techniques and technologies: the steam engine, new manufacturing processes. The intellectual revolution paved the way for the industrial one.
And how did the Industrial Revolution loop back and drive international relations? More stuff, more trade.
More stuff, yes, but also created insatiable demands. Monarchs and states now had powerful industries that needed vast quantities of raw materials: coal, iron, cotton, to keep the factories running.
Feed the machines.
Exactly. And just as crucially, they needed markets to sell the increasing volume of manufactured goods these factories were churning out. This dual need for resources and markets, and often cheap labor, became a central driving force in international politics.
You need resources, need customers.
Right. And this economic imperative was encapsulated by the prevailing economic theory of the era: mercantilism.
Mercantilism, we heard that before. What is it exactly?
Mercantilism, which heavily influenced European monarchs and states from maybe the 16th to 18th centuries, held that national wealth and power were best achieved by maximizing exports, minimizing imports, and accumulating precious metals, like gold and silver. Think of it as economic nationalism.
Sell more than you buy, hoard gold.
That's the basic idea. This often required state control of trade, protectionist policies like tariffs, and critically, the acquisition of colonies.
Why colonies?
Colonies were seen as essential to provide exclusive sources of raw materials, cheap labor, often slave labor, and captive markets for the mother country's manufactured goods. A closed economic system designed to benefit the colonizing power.
So the Industrial Revolution and mercantilism created this intense economic competition among European powers,
Yeah.
fueling rivalry.
Exactly. The search for resources, labor, and markets fueled interstate rivalry among European countries like never before. The countries industrializing most rapidly: France, Denmark, but particularly Britain, which had gained a political stability advantage after its glorious revolution in 1688 and had a powerful navy.
Britain leading the pack.
They embarked on aggressive imperial expansion. This led to a feverish scramble to colonize territories in Asia, Africa, the Americas, everywhere, driven by these mercantilist and imperialist ambitions. The scramble for Africa, in the late 19th century is a prime example.
And this intense rivalry among the European powers over controlling territories elsewhere led to what within Europe? Did it make things calmer there?
Ironically, no. This external competition heightened the internal European imperative to maintain the balance of power among themselves. They engaged in a complex, ever-shifting dance of alliances and counter-alliances, attempting to manage this growing rivalry and prevent any single power from dominating the colonial race or the continent itself.
Trying to keep a lid on it.
Trying, yes. But despite these efforts to maintain equilibrium, none of the alliance systems could fully contain the escalating tensions, mistrust, and suspicion among the major European powers. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria, Hungary. Nationalism was rising too.
Sounds like a powder keg.
It was becoming one. This volatile scenario, fueled by industrial competition, imperial ambitions, nationalism, and complex alliances, made a large-scale conflict among them increasingly inevitable.
And that inevitably led to, well, we know where it led.
Exactly. The convergence of intense interstate rivalry within Europe, driven by industrial and imperial competition, coupled with the desire to prevent any single power from achieving continental or global supremacy, ultimately brought Europe to its first truly continental conflict, which rapidly escalated into a global war, World War I.
The Great War.
The Great War. The source material sets the stage perfectly for this, indicating that the next chapter, the next part of this historical journey, will pick up right here, delving into the specifics of the lead-up to WWI, the tumultuous interwar period, and the tragedy of World War II.
Wow. It's remarkable, really, to trace that line all the way from a peace treaty between ancient Mesopotamian kings through Kautilya and Sun Tzu, the Greeks, feudalism, Westphalia, Enlightenment, all the way to the edge of the First World War. We've covered an incredible sweep of history today.
We really have. From the earliest traces of diplomacy, those distinct ancient approaches, the balance of power popping up early, the medieval shifts, and then those huge intersecting forces with their states. Renaissance, Reformation, discoveries, Industrial Revolution, shattering the old order and building the foundations of the modern state system codified at Westphalia.
It puts so much into perspective.
It is vital to see that the principles that crystallized during Europe's ascent, state sovereignty, the norm of non-interference, professional diplomacy, the balance of power, international law, they aren't just dusty historical concepts. As the source makes clear, they became the absolute bedrock of today's international law and the prevailing world order.
Still shaping things today.
Absolutely. They define what states are and how they interact globally, even now, even as they're being challenged or reinterpreted.
Exactly. So for you listening, you now have, hopefully, a far deeper understanding of the historical forces, the foundational ideas, and those recurring patterns that underpin the international headlines you read today. Whether it's about alliances shifting, power struggles, or principles of sovereignty being debated, you can see the deep roots of the present in this distant past we've explored.
And as we've seen how history reveals enduring patterns, illustrating this with examples like the long shadow of external intervention in Afghanistan, it leaves us with a compelling question to consider, maybe mull over.
Yeah.
Given that these historical patterns persist and shape the present, what other patterns do you observe unfolding in the world right now? Based on what we've discussed, what echoes of the past do you see in current events? And maybe more importantly, what might those recurring patterns be telling us about the path ahead for international relations in the coming years?
A lot to think about indeed. History not just as a rearview mirror, but maybe as a signpost too. Thank you for joining us on this foundational deep dive into the history of international relations.